Anyone else think it's absolutely wild that the number of millionaires in the world has more than doubled since 2012?
Well, since fiat currency has more than halved in value, that shouldn't be surprising.
Did not know. Is that due to the amount of stimulus or the amount of money that was put into the United States economy from the U.S. government?
Basically, you can see that just by seeing what's happened to asset prices and scarce assets. It may not all show up in the M2 money supply, but the M2 money supply is way up also, but it's mostly reflected in high-end assets, which is kind of what millionaires would spend their money on anyway. The COVID lockdowns were not free. You shut down the economy for 2 years. You got to pay for that somehow.
To me, it's just wild that there are so many millionaires on the planet, even now, and that's happened over the past decade. It harkens to the idea that it's sure we're moving at a faster pace, and we are creating a lot more technology and better technology that is actually increasing asset prices for these organizations as well as for individuals. But I just kind of figured there's a long way to go, and also there's probably going to be more increases to the money supply too. For example, if you run a thought experiment of, let's say you give everyone $20,000 on the planet and just to get to basic poverty level a year, then you would need for 8 billion people, including kids, about $300 trillion in the money supply, just to be circulating through not just the U.S., but the world. And I read online once it was about $80 trillion right now, so you still need to 4x the amount of money supply that's currently available.
But it's not about money supply. Money is just a claim to real-world productive assets. What you need to make poor people richer are more productive assets and the knowledge on how to use them. So just adding more money and handing it out doesn't do anything. You're just chopping up the existing pie. And in many cases, when you hand it out, you're giving it to someone who doesn't actually know how it was created. And so they'll spend it. In other words, they'll eat the fish rather than learn how to catch a fish. So the best solution to the growth of prosperity and getting people out of poverty is to educate them, give them tools, and allow them to engage in free market capitalism. And that's what's worked since the beginning of time.
Totes agree. We all need to be productive assets. I think there was a really good quote by a guy that in Pittsburgh that was trying to bring people that were homeless in order to become productive members of society through immersing them into a better life for themselves. And the quote was that a person can't live a good life if they don't know what a good life feels like. So that means that if you can't really be productive without actually knowing, I think not as easily without and in mass without actually, I'm not sure what I'm saying, but just you can't be productive without actually understanding how to be productive, in my opinion. And to do that in mass, a lot of people are especially at the bottom of the pyramid, are focused on basic essentials like food and shelter and electricity as well as water. To get to the point where you can actually be on the internet, become a knowledge worker, or just become a highly productive worker in society, there's a lot of basic steps there that aren't really there. And to get to basic poverty level, I figure is en masse a good starting point for a lot of folks to become millionaires or billionaires, trillionaires, what have you. It's cool we're even at this point of having this many millionaires on the planet.
Ooh, watching movies with subtitles in all directions is absolutely a superpower. That's how I learned a lot of Portuguese at the time, way back when, in other languages. But Jeff, you've got a good approach here too. It is it's multimodal. The tough thing is it's multimodal, but it's also n equals 1. And so I think everyone individually should like cast a wide net of all those things you're discussing, but then something ends up working better. Like for instance, I go in almost exclusively through the irregular verbs. That's just my thing. That's how I understand the structure of language, and it works well for me. And I know what phrases I need to learn in the beginning, and it doesn't take me long to get like passively functionally being able to speak, and then the rest of it comes along with what really makes people understand you, like slowing down and caring and like using your body language. It's just like hanging in the moment, pre-language. That French sea captain, what was his or her name? What did she teach you about the sea, Kamal? La mer. That's a great song. Learning to sing songs in other languages is pretty fun. C'est la vie, qu'est-ce qu'on va faire? Ça marche. I'm just going to double click on this note. There was actually a big statistical reporting change to M1 and M2, where all of a sudden, like a lot of money that used to be considered M1 was recategorized as M2. So on the charts, it looks like some crazy onset of money. And it is, don't get me wrong, printing's a real thing, but there's also the M2 money supply. That data set has like a crinkle in it. Well, I think the kind of the great undiscussed fact of actually it is discussed, because you're right. What you're saying, that the idea isn't to teach a man to fish; it's to give him the fish. Like they do actually want them to eat it. They wanted to spend it, and that's why it helps, because the 20,000 you inject into one family gets spent across 20 businesses. And then at some point, it trickles to I think what you would call the productive asset base, or that mindset. And then that mindset understands to take on debt and now leverage what small percentage of that $20,000 it got to actually, have a productive path forward and start to create more value than it was put into it with the initial cash consumption. But the main thing is, you're right, that if you say, these 10 marbles are the economy, and they run the economy, and then you give them another 90 marbles, and come back in 10 years and let the economy settle, everything in the economy should generally cost 10 times as many marbles as it did before, but there's 10 times as many marbles. So in a normalized sense, it's identically the same surface.
Thanks, Keith. I just kind of figure that thinking about the world of abundance, especially when it comes to decreased costs of electricity, almost near zero, and then also the aspect of reduced healthcare, like maybe everyone gets healthcare. I don't know. That might be pretty cool. That drastically reduces down the amount of cost of material goods, whether it be food, whether it be shelter, in order to produce. And I just kind of figure that $20,000 number is there just to say that's the poverty level needed right now, but maybe down the line it might not be as much. So I kind of figured, okay, well, if that's the case, then maybe just give people enough in order to subsist, to give them a chance to do whatever they want to do in life. And when I say whatever they want to do in life, practically, like, people can teach themselves to fish nowadays, especially with the tremendous amount of knowledge available through the internet, and through apps, and through people that are well-educated, are far more well-educated than they used to be 20, 30, 40, 50 years previously, at the same age. And it's just kind of like, why not make it easy for people to do whatever they want to do in life? That includes millionaires. People shouldn't be throttled by how much money that they have.
Yeah, I don't think I meant to disagree with you. I liked the opportunity to follow onto Naval and just make the broad statements about money supply and prices over time, etc. However, I know you dropped it, baby. Just give me a moment. However, I guess I would just say I totally agree with you about the abundance mindset. However, we got to be careful with our terms, because it is an abundant world, but that also doesn't mean that if we peg the price of a barrel of oil to $1, that's not going to create serious problems. Like, the concept of abundance and how we manage the society's resources to be as fair as possible is absolutely worth considering, but you can't then take the conclusion that we live in an abundant world and then apply it everywhere in the real economy, because the real economy, yes, there's an abundance of everything, but what there isn't an abundance of is individual human actors that are trying to aggregate its claims to as many real resources as possible. That part is not abundant. It's competitive, and we all can and do come out in the head, but I don't think that abundance comment should be, like, for instance, $20,000 per person. It's not an abundance comment to say whether it'll work or not. Now, it is a practical comment that acknowledges the long-term arc of humanity to say that, what we should not be is parsimonious, where it's just some paper money that we actually want to have an effect. The effect is not that we want, isn't to give them the money, and it isn't just to get them to spend it. The effect that we really, really want is for money to exist in the economy so that over time we can deploy it more wisely and enjoy this kind of ever upwards increasing quality of life on average over time for another 200 years, 2,000 years, 2 million years. And here's the thing I would say. The money supply is not what creates inefficiencies. Like, there's lots of inefficiencies on the money supply side of it, but it's for the same reason that there's no fixable efficiencies on the human side of it, which is the humans. Like, there's money systems that solve lots of analytical problems, but how the humans allocate the resources is everywhere and always going to matter, right? So, it's kind of unrelated. The fact of you giving everyone $20,000 is absolutely fine, but the real world use case is the fact that you can't actually control that money, and you're not just trying to give them $20,000 to just go spend money and everyone comes out neutral. You actually want them to come out of it with skills and benefits that they didn't go into it with. And then over time, you want the economy to writ large to invest in that economy, that splurge of paper resources that were made available to some subset of the total population. So, and remember, my intention here is just to introduce a layer of texture and consideration to it. And for example, I don't think you mean it like this, but like, millionaires paying more in taxes makes sense for a lot of sense, and that's not throttling them. So there's a language problem. What you do to throttle a millionaire versus what you do to like splurge on a Social Security recipient with $20,000, right? That's very non-germane to the world of meaning, which is what you're trying to achieve, and whether you're able to achieve that goal when you put out the resources, the ability for those people to change the world themselves. What do you get back in return? And it's not an investment per se in a financial sense. It's an investment in like a corporeal sense. Same reason you go to the gym. You need your individual members to be healthy. Are you fucking kidding me? And this has been on my mind a lot lately, and it's actually nothing to do with you, so please. But remember, so once we bring the concept of abundance into an analytical argument, the whole thing breaks down, because abundance means you can't measure and compare and say, oh, well, there's more of these and less of these, and there's relative, like, how do we do this? Once you say things are abundant, there's no more weighing of options, because the answer could always and everywhere be, well, it's abundant, right? So it's a useful term, but I hesitate to bring it into concepts of how like an economy should be observed or tracked, right? Because, I think we all have an abundance mindset, and we're all Bitcoiners, and realize that like you can't just have free lunches forever. So, and it's not that there's a contradiction in there. Rather, the contradiction in there is that like we have the ideas of abundance are separate from the ideas of the analytical world, which is fine. And we just, to have great conversations, it is easier for me if we're on the same page, that we won't have a weights and measures comparison conversation and then put abundance on the scale either in the first measure or the last. And interestingly, this nuance between what is abundant and goes on forever and what does not is very nicely served in nature by the conservation principles, right? Like mass is conserved, angular momentum is conserved. There are these principles that are conserved no matter what rotation or projection happens to how you look at it, how you analyze it. And the fact that they're conserved means that everywhere else, all of the universe is abundant. But in the basic fundamental conservation principles of physics, that means the abundance argument can't be made there. We are in the world of analytics at that point. Or not the abundance argument can't be made there, but in the physical world, conservation rules are where you can durably rely on math always evening out. But then in the spiritual and intellectual and conceptual world, the math goes everywhere and abundance does make sense because it is infinite. And we can talk about all that stuff. I'm very aware of the divide between the two now more than ever. And good morning. I'm the only person awake on the East Coast. It's just you and me. Naval will delete these after. Anyway, welcome to Chit Chat. It's great to talk to you, man. People's voice. It's so good.
Give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day. Teach a man to fish and he'll eat forever. That's the saying, right? I mean, it's kind of painfully obvious. The issue isn't that we're giving people fish. The issue is that we're not teaching people how to fish. And that's pretty apparent by how unequally distributed knowledge is in today's society. You know, this is complicated by the fact that people don't learn how to fish very well when they're really, really hungry. So how do we get people's bellies full enough that they have enough bandwidth to pay attention to the lessons? And how do we as a society actually create and transmit those lessons more equally? Because I think there's a lot of people that would learn, but they're not very good at being able to teach themselves how to do it. Not everybody's an autodidact. And, you know, this obviously applies to people that would like to learn how to fish, not the people who would prefer to just watch you fish and eat your fish every day.
Well, here's the thing. That analogy breaks down because at the end of the day, in the real world of that pure story, if you teach one man to fish, yes, he will fish for a lifetime, but that doesn't mean he can then turn and teach every man to fish so that every man, every human will always be abundantly provided for. There's still a layer of competition and actual resources like gauge theoretic resources. By gauge theoretic, I mean physical world resources where, yes, we can 10x the food supply. Can we 10x it in 2 years, in 20 years, in 200 years? I think those are the sorts of arrangements that I like to keep the abundance quotation marks out of. Sort of like the last gorilla in that Seinfeld episode. Like everything eats everything all the way down. What happens to the gorillas? Oh, they die off in winter. So it's contextual. Like it's obvious on its face, not all men can fish, period. Now, recognizing it's an analogy, I agree, except it always becomes a question of like, what's the teaching a man to fish that you're actually imparting, and over what time does that now become meaningless and expected? And frankly, the only way that whole process kind of works on its own, picks itself up by its bootstraps, is this competition where it's the man who learns to fish that, like, what he also did was goes there every morning for 2 years until the master fisherman taught him how to fish. Like, so I love this analogy, and obviously I'm playing it to my own accord, so I won't explain the assumptions that went into the conclusion that was built on the assumptions. Good morning.
I guess what I'm getting at is that there will always be plenty of competition at the level of who is the best fisher at the pond, and that we may all be ultimately better served by not having as many people hanging around the edge of the pond that don't know how to fish, that are begging for or trying to steal your fish. So if all those people, the ones that don't know how to fish but would like to, can be better taught, then we're all going to be better off.
Junaid, I just love this. I love this so much. And I think that's why it's so difficult to discuss capitalism and its pitfalls, because people then assume when you're saying this is not working that you are criticizing the entire system, but really it's the detail of the implementation that is dangerous. And I think if those people who would like to fish but don't know how and end up becoming thieves become the tinder that causes revolutions, that causes societal instability, you cannot ignore them. You cannot say that, yes, these people are going to be able to figure it out on their own. They should be able to. They should have personal agency. Well, they don't. And it's in your interest to have them taught, to have them Think about them. Don't forget them. I don't know. I think I may have come across as really passionate there, but I love that. Well, Keith, I can hear what Junaid is talking about here. And I think, I don't know, man, there's something about the purity of expecting people to be able to figure things out on their own and the actual reality of the fact that people don't. And we cannot ignore the times when that happens in a large scale, such that we start seeing societally that a lot more people are not fishing. And it is in our interest to try and solve the problem. We cannot just simply say, well, the system is fine as it is. We still have to challenge it. And I think the discussion should incorporate those types of like, okay, cool. So how does this look practically? How do we do that? How do we teach the fishing to these people? There is the theoretical side of it, which is great. This is how the economy is supposed to work. We're supposed to leave it as it is. But when we start seeing results skewed in a direction that makes our society unstable, we do have to question that maybe what we expect of human beings based on this theory that we believe is perfect doesn't actually hold up in reality. Maybe human beings do actually fail sometimes under that system. But the problem is that when it starts failing to a point where it affects the stability of the entire system, we have to pay attention to it. And I'm not sure if I'm contradicting anyone or fighting anyone, but that's really the point I'm trying to make. I'm going to shut up now. I guess the issue I'm making here, which is my last point, and I promise I'm not saying anything else for the rest of the weekend. If we're producing results, or the system is producing results that we're not happy with, we are not going to say that capitalism is bad or capitalism is not good. We can say this implementation right here is causing problems. And that's why I don't like talking about things big. This is deep waters for me, because big things are problematic. If you're discussing a specific issue that's causing homelessness, then you can say this is what's causing it. You cannot just say capitalism or communism or socialism. It then loses, the texture that allows us to discuss it intelligently, right? That's it. I promise. Done.
Ooh, this is actually the perfect retort, because you're right. Short term, the material parameters don't change the fact that we should set a more positive and ambitious vision to fix the problems that we surely see. So, I think too many times for me personally, on different sides of different discussions, but slowing down, of course, on the human level, we have to think about that stuff. It's more than one of everything. Good morning. I tagged you on Twitter. It's good stuff. So following on that reasonable retort, in the short term, it's tough to adjust things too much, let's say more than 7 or 8% in either direction. Even that's a lot, right? So in the short term, my personal opinion would be roll up my sleeves as a household and look at exactly sort of where money is going, where money is coming from. Because remember, you're always taking away from one group to deliver to another, albeit in a strange phenomena. And those mechanisms work. Like, for instance, the same people that me included in different conversations, you can rail against $10 billion in some sort of spending, right? But you would also rail against, that's the same thing as unwinding 10 billion worth of corporate taxes and whatnot. And there is an instability that develops when anything's lopsided as a container. And we are hopefully the mechanism by which we pierce it a little bit. Holy moly. Because this is the point where you could actually just open it up like a household budget and say, this is everything that happened last year. Let's start from there and, like, in a vacuum, really work through where we would change allocations to make this happen, and whether we think based on common sense, like the right type of inference, not the inference that anything could happen, but the inference that, like, there are likelihoods that if we concentrate on them, we can actually predict them better than just waiting and accounting for randomized results. It's a different type of inference. It's a thought process. It's not always a bad thing.
I guess my line of thought here is from the world of abundance. I always thought that, like, if we're on the cusp of turning into a spacefaring civilization, thanks to a lot of the work that Elon Musk and his teams are doing over at SpaceX and Tesla, and also Neuralink, inner world and the outer world are going to become much more expansive and available or accessible to all of us to explore. And so cutting down the costs attached to having a kind of a start to explore the universe, it sounds like really cool and makes sense with the world of abundance.
Absolutely it is. The issue is that abstractions are not real things, and when people introduce these big abstractions, and maybe the issue is more that the things are abstract rather than they are big, because big real things we can handle, but big abstract things, well, it's a bit arbitrary, isn't it? The word capitalism or socialism means something else to every person. And once you start blaming things on abstractions, you cannot have a reasonable discussion. So if you really want to have a good faith debate about any of these social issues and stuff, you need to be super sure that you are talking about concrete, particular, real, everyday things. And you have to take words like capitalism and socialism and everything else completely off the table, like no abstractions allowed. Then very often you will find out that you can reach agreement with even ideological enemies surprisingly easily. Because a large part of the function of these abstractions is to divide people and to carry unspoken assumptions. So, just talk about the actual stuff and leave these magic spells on the shelf. Everything becomes easier.
Thank you, Brothers Binik. I agree with what you said here. Spot on. I consider myself a very fortunate person to live in a time where I can engage with such beautiful minds. Thank you.
And the problem with these abstractions is that they carry unspoken assumptions, obviously, but also they carry emotional charges. They are shortcuts, they are shorthands, and they can be thought-terminating cliches that actually obscure reality and prevent people from looking at the actual things. So, for example, you can ask a person, do you think people should be able to voluntarily transact with each other, exchange goods and services, and keep most of the fruits of their labors? Everyone in the world will say yes, obviously, that's the most, that's the clearest thing you can say. That's obviously moral. That's a good thing. And then you ask the same people, what do you think about capitalism? Oh, it's the worst thing, man. It's just overthrow and smash the entire affair. It's just two different descriptions of the same thing. So the problem with these abstractions is even when they start out as useful shortcuts, so that you don't have to explain, complex positions every time you want to refer to them. Once the concept exists, open warfare erupts around loading it with prejudices and emotional reactions that then prevent any kind of good faith, realistic, constructive debate. So, unfortunately, I have found out that very often you simply have to take these useful shorthands off the table and force people to talk about what they really mean. TLDR, it's not possible to have a real debate in the presence of knee-jerk emotional reactions, and it's not possible not to have knee-jerk emotional reactions whilst loaded concepts are being used. So, yeah. Life pro tip, when you want to discuss important things with people who think differently, talk about the actual things and try to keep the ideological constructs and loaded terminology off the table as much as possible. Easier said than done, because when you're dealing with bad faith people, they will insist on using them because it's their only weapon. To de-escalate the culture wars, minimize abstraction. Keep it concrete. That's the life pro tip. I'll see myself out and go have another gin tonic.